Well, good morning. All right, good to be here today. Whether you knew it or not, this is National Pulpit Supply Day. Did y'all realize that? So as a staff member for 30-something years in the church before I came to LC, I preach more on this Sunday for my pastors than any other Sunday of the year because it's a time between Christmas and New Year's where you don't want to miss Christmas Sunday if you don't have to because it's Christmas Sunday. And then when it comes to, coming into New Year, your kids are off of school. And as a pastor, you rarely take all the time you can off during the course of the year because things are so busy. And I have a lot of sermons, but I'm not preaching one of those today. I'm preaching something a little bit different than what I've typically preached through the years on this Sunday. I got to preach at First Baptist LeCount this morning. It's always good to be out there with our sister church, our one church, or however we want to say it. And it's always good to be with them. And if you ever wonder why Brother Stewart smells like peanut butter when he comes here, we get all the men at that church get peanut brittle in the morning. So if you ever want peanut brittle and you like it, go to First Baptist LeCount. It's just one of those things that you didn't know unless you've ever been there. And I still have some in my truck, but I didn't bring it in to share with you this morning. It's always interesting to drive between LeCount and here because I'm one of those guys that thinks of all the what ifs. So I'm like, well, what if Brother Stewart's truck ever breaks down? What if my truck breaks down this morning on the way? What do I do? Do I hitchhike? Do I call a cop? How do I get here? And then I saw something I never saw before, a car driving by me, and it had a cat in the windshield of the car just riding there. And then as my mind goes, it's kind of like, well, if that car ever gets in a wreck and that airbag goes off, that's not a good place for a cat to be sitting. And they were probably calling their friends going, this poor guy in the middle of I-49 in between nowhere. We're from Texas. We don't know where we are. He was dressed up like a preacher with a headphone and everything on this morning, looking like he was trying to preach somewhere. And probably was wondering about that as well. Just an update from Louisiana Christian University, LC. They have narrowed down on the presidential search to their top 5 candidates, and will begin interviewing those 5 people in person early this month, in the next week or two, and then hope to have someone to bring to the Board of Trustees at the end of February for the next president of LC. And so that's all on the website. That's something that everybody knows if you want to know. But that's one of the things I get asked the most often right now. How's it going? Where are they going? And they just tell me it's going good. Of course, being on staff there and working in the position I'm in, I'm not a part of that. I don't determine who brings in my next boss, as you probably aren't either usually in your work. But continue to pray for that. Louisiana Baptists have established the first Sunday in February as the day of prayer for Louisiana Christian University. And so I know that we'll be participating in that as well. This morning we're going to be in the book of Judges. Judges chapter 6 and 7, looking at the life of Gideon as we talk about how we respond to God's call. Now, I don't know about you, but God called me a long time ago to do different things, and I didn't always respond the right way. But God has always been patient with me and graceful to me, in how He has led and looked at me. So I'm going to give you my 60-second history lesson on the book of Judges here this morning. So not too much into that, but we're looking at the life of the nation of Israel after they had conquered Canaan, and it was roughly a 350-year period of deterioration to where they had really often had forgotten about who God was, what He had called them from, what they had called them to, and they would fall back into worshiping idols of Baal and Asherah and all the gods of the Canaanites around them. And it was kind of one of those cycles. So if you ever study the book of Judges, so I've taught the book of Judges. Now don't ask me why I taught it in this. I was over the school, so it was my fault, I guess. But we had the curriculum for 7th grade Bible. Half the year was the book of Judges. Now teach 7th graders the book of Judges, and you come across some interesting things in the book of Judges if you've ever read that. But those students would still come to me, and I don't see them very often anymore, but they would have graduated from high school, and they would say, Brother David, we remember so-and-so, and there's some very vivid stories in the book of Judges. Gideon is one of those as well. But there was a cycle of sin and deliverance where people would fall into sin, they would go away from God as a nation, God would discipline them with foreign oppressors coming in and kind of experiencing the results of their sin. And then the people would cry out, and then God would raise up a deliverer, or what we would call a judge. And then that judge would bring about God's grace and restoration and peace and prosperity until the nation of Israel would then forget about God, turn away from God, and start worshiping other false gods. That happened over and over again in those 350 years. And this is one of those cycles that we're going through here, where God used a young man named Gideon to bring about the restoration of his nation and to bring about peace and a time of peace and prosperity after the nation had begun to cry out. Now, the story starts with Gideon, with an angel of God coming to Gideon, and he's threshing wheat in a wine press. Now, that's kind of not something we'd be able to understand today, but when they threshed wheat back in that day and time, they would generally stand on a hill somewhere where the breeze could catch it, and you would throw the wheat up into the air. The chaff, the light part, would fly away, and then the wheat or the kernel would fall back down to the ground, and that's how they would separate the wheat from the chaff, right? So Gideon is doing this not on the top of a hill, because if you can think about it in that day and time, and you're being oppressed and all these different people have conquered you and are in the area, if they saw you up on a hill, that would be a sign for miles around to see that these bad guys, we'll call them, would come and steal the wheat. So he was in a wine press, and if you can imagine, I would just equate it to this. I'd be in my grandpa's horse barn in one of the stalls throwing wheat up into the air, about 8 foot, 9 foot into the air, and it hit in the ceiling and falling right back down on top of me. You can imagine it's not very, he's not being a very brave guy. He's trying to hide it. He's probably very nasty, very sweaty. And the angel comes to them and addresses him as mighty warrior. So God knows, and the angel was told what's going to happen. But in that day and time, in that part of Gideon's life, we see him right at the beginning. And this is Gideon's response to God in Judges chapter 6, verse 13. And Gideon said to him, O Lord, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, then why has all of this happened to us? And where did all of his miracles, which our fathers told us about, saying, did the Lord not bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and has handed us over to Midian. Gideon was an example of one of those young men who had known what God had done in the past, had heard about the stories of what God had done in the past. And in our day and time, he had been to Sunday school, he memorized the verses, he knew what was going on, but he did not have a personal relationship with God, and had never probably seen God do anything in his life or the life of his family. He had just heard about this ancient God that supposedly we follow, that did all these great things in the past, but he's done nothing for us today. And Gideon was being honest and asking God this question. And we see God being very patient with him. And answering in verse 15, chapter 6, verse 15, he said to him, this was Gideon, but he said to him, O Lord, how am I to save Israel? Behold, my family is the least in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's house. And yet the Lord said to him, I will certainly be with you, and you will defeat Midian as one man. So Gideon said to him, now if I found favor in your sight, then perform for me a sign that it is you speaking with me. Please do not depart from here until I come back to you and bring my offering and lay it before you. And he said, I will remain until you return. Then Gideon went in and prepared a young goat and unleavened bread from an ephah of flour. And he put the meat in a basket and broth in a pot and brought them out to him under the oak and presented them. And an angel of the God said to him, take the meat and unleavened bread and lay them on the rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. And the angel of the Lord put out the end of a staff which was in his hand and touched the meat and unleavened bread. And fire came up from the rock and consumed the meat and unleavened bread. And then the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. And Gideon perceived that the angel of the Lord, he said, O Lord God, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. But the Lord said to him, peace to you, do not be afraid, you shall not die. Gideon had an aha moment, much unlike anything I've ever had. God has never told me to bring something out and then he would cause it to flame up and to be consumed from a rock, not getting anything anywhere. But Gideon understood who he was in front of, who he was talking to, and that there was something true. At least he was beginning to see at least the understanding about all of the things that had taken place in the past. This might still be true for me today. And so Gideon's first step of obedience, God calls him to confront Israel's rebellion in his own home. Now, he was a young man still under the authority of his father, and as we would have been in our day and time, much like he was in that day and time. And God calls Gideon to take one of his dad's prized bulls, which I don't know if you know anything about agricultural society. I definitely do not, but I've read a lot about it. A prized bull would have been a very valuable commodity that his father would have had in the production of more cows in that day and time. And he says, I want you to take your dad's best bull. I want you to tear down the altar to Baal that your father has established. I want you to cut down the Asherah pole, which was a big wooden pole made to the god Asherah. And I want you to use that pole for the flame, for the fire of the offering that you're going to make of your father's bull. Is that something your dad probably would have appreciated you doing back in his property back in the day? Taking something that was worth that much money, tearing down what he had led the family in to do what God has called you to do. But he did it. He did it at night, so nobody would exactly know who it was that did all these things. And of course, just as in that day and time as it is now, nothing is ever a secret, really. You understand that? So the next day, the result of Gideon following God, doing exactly what he called him to do, resulted in people coming and wanting to kill him. So it says it right there in Scripture, in Judges chapter 6, the people come and go to his dad and say, what happened actually happened, and we know it was your son Gideon, and we want you to give us your son so that we can go and kill him. And I love what his dad said here. Chapter 6, verses 30 and 31. Then the men of the city said to Joash, and that's the dad, bring out your son that he may die, for he has torn down the altar of Baal, and indeed he has cut down the Asherah which is beside it. But Joash said to all who stood against him, will you contend for Baal, or will you deliver him? Whoever will plead for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him contend for himself, because someone has torn down his altar. I love what Joash did, because he said, guys, you're not touching my son, number one. And if Baal is such a god, then let Baal worry about his altar being torn down and the Asherah pole being torn down, and you let him worry about that, and you let me worry about my son. That's a great place to be as a son, isn't it? When you that's where I would like to be, and hopefully I've been as a dad in all of these years. So the dad responds not by saying, I'm so mad at you, Gideon. You destroyed my property, you tore down these kind of things. But evidently, somewhere in there, Gideon's dad understood and knew that what Gideon was right, and God was calling that nation back together to do the right things through him. The next step of Gideon's obedience was when God called him to raise up an army to go against their oppressors. And despite being clear about the will of what God's will was, and that he was going to be empowered by the Spirit of God, and he had 32,000 men come to his summons saying that he was going to go to battle, Gideon is still a little bit nervous about what's going on here. And I guess I might have been as well. So God was calling Gideon to lead an army of 32,000 men to go against the enemies of God, which put his own life on the line, and not only his own life, but the life of many thousands of men going to battle. And this is one of those, to me, it's the most famous story of Gideon. Because Gideon says, all right, God, I've seen you do these things in the past, and you took care of me whenever I did what you asked me to do at my house, but now you're asking me to do something that's even bigger, that's making me step out even more out of my comfort zone, and if you don't follow through, I'm going to physically lose my life. And he said, if you're going to be patient with me, God, do this one thing. And you see in chapter 6, verses 36 through 39, he puts out the fleece, meaning he puts out the skin and the wool of, we assume, a sheep or something like that. It just says he threw the fleece on the ground, and he basically says, God, if you're in this, I'm going to throw this out on the ground, and in the morning, if it's wet and all the ground around it is dry, I know this is what you're telling me to do. It's not just something, me being crazy in my head. I know it's going to be you. So the next morning he goes out, the fleece is wet, the ground is dry. And then so what does Gideon do? Does he respond in obedience? All right, God, let's just make sure this wasn't a coincidence. If you can just be patient with me one more time, let's do it again, but let's do it the opposite. Lord, if I put this fleece out and it's dry in the morning and all the ground around it is wet, the opposite here, if you do that for me one more time and I know this, then I really, really know that it's you. And then somehow in God's, he even says it, do not let your anger burn against me so that I may speak only one more time. And God was gracious and God was patient with Gideon and did and performed that sign again, and he knew what happened. I've done the same thing in my life before. Years ago as a freshman at LC, I felt God, or not as a freshman, but as a student at LC, I felt God calling me to do something, and I needed money, and God was telling me, I'll provide for you, and I want you to do something else other than work for money. I want you to work and do things in a different way. And I said, all right, God. I'd been a Christian for a number of years, and now you're going to laugh at the amount of money that I challenged God with because I should have done a lot more, all right? So I went to God, and, this is 1990, 91, somewhere in there, and I went to God. I'm not going to go through and explain the whole story. I said, God, if this is really you, then I need you to provide for me. And this was a lot of money back then. I just need you to provide for me $100 a month. I said, if you want me to do this, this is really you calling me to do this. This is not just something I'm making up in my mind. God, I need $100 a month to cover my expenses because I had to pay my insurance and my gas and my, this, that, and the other. And kind of left it at that. Not proud of it. It's not a high moment in my spiritual walk in life. I should have said, yes, Lord, I'll do it, and I'll let you provide in whatever way. But I was a lot like Gideon here. And then just a couple of days later, I went to my LC mailbox. If you were an LC student back in the day when I was, you realize what that was about. And opened it up and had a letter from a friend I hadn't seen in years. And he was a member of our youth group back when I lived in Slidell for a couple of years. And he said, hey, Dave, I'm off working. Haven't seen or heard from you in a long time, but God laid this on my heart to give to you. It's not he said, I can't explain it other than God wanted me to give it to you. Here's $100 that I want you to have, and just thank you for what you're doing and following God. So right there on the grass in between the Student Center and Hattie B's, I just had a Jesus moment and said, sorry about that, God, and I trust you. And the next month after month coming for about however long that semester was, 4 months or so, God provided $100 a month for me in different ways. It wasn't from a friend, it was just different ways every month. Didn't always come $100 at one time, but through those months, God sustained $100 a month, and that set the course. Not that I've been perfect and do it right still as I go forward, but that set the course and tone for what God wanted to do with me as I went forward. So God can be patient with us, thankfully. Did God have to do that for me? Did God have to do that for Gideon? He definitely did not. And then we see that when God was patient there, we see the next biggest story for Gideon. He goes into battle. He's got 32,000 men. God says that's too many. Tell everybody, if anybody's scared, they're not too comfortable about this, to go home. 32,000, 22,000 take off. That means how many are left? There we go. We got some math people in here. The LeCount campus was listening this morning too. 10,000 are left. And now I'm not going into why God chose to weed the people down after this, but he said, all right, when they go get to drink from the water, those that put their mouth to the water and drink, and they don't use their hand and pull it up to their mouth, you send the guys home that drink like a dog. They go down to the water, and the rest you keep. And that wound up being how many men? 300, right? 300 men that God was going to go to battle with. And then we see that God gives him one more chance, not one more chance, but gives him one more sign. And Gideon didn't ask for this sign, but in chapter 7, verses 9 through 14, you see that as they sneak into the camp, the Midianites, that Gideon confirms of what God has told him to do and the plan of which God has told him to do and how to defeat them. He hears the army officers from the enemy say, "These are the dreams that we've been having," and it confirms for Gideon one more time, I'm doing what God has asked me to do. And what God asked him to do is one of those famous stories that we learned about in Sunday school, that God defeats them through Gideon with trumpets, jars, and torches. Remember that? They get on the mountain around them, and when Gideon blows the horn or blows the trumpet, they all smash their jars, bring out their torches, wave them around, blow the trumpets, and God creates chaos and brings victory with only 300 men. And we see that God is glorified, not because of who Gideon was or from what he did, but that he was obedient, and God used him to deliver the nation through him. And we see that through all the weaknesses, through all of the, I don't want to do this, I'm not sure, I don't even really know who you are, God. God patiently does that with him through every step of the way. And we see that God uses him as a judge of the nation of Israel to bring about restoration to the nation, to bring about faithfulness to the nation, at least for a little while, and in the arc of things leading to the first king coming in the years following that. So I just want to go over a couple of things about God's call in our lives based upon Gideon's example for us this morning. The first one is that God addresses us with the realization of what his power can accomplish through us. It's never about you. It's never about me. It's never about the pastor. It's never about the individual. It's always about what God can do through us because of his power and his grace, not upon our own goodness, not upon our own merit, or any of those kind of things. And thankfully, that's true. We read back through the Old and New Testament, and we see men and women God used were not perfect. They didn't do everything just right. And I don't know if that brings you hope or not, because I identify with a lot of those people. Throughout my life, I identify saying, I haven't always obeyed the first time. I've always never just said, yes, God, I'll do this. And I've questioned God from time to time and done those things. But we see as we go through, it's always about his power accomplishing through us, not what we can do on our own for him. The second thing is that we are an ideal vehicle to be used when we come to God in our own weakness. Now, I'm not saying God doesn't use our strengths, if that makes sense. So there was a lot of people up on stage this morning who have strengths in music. I am one of those people up on stage this morning who does not have strength in music. I will not, like Brother Stewart, ever start singing part of I'll clear out the building very quickly if I start singing, all right? Not saying that God doesn't use people who are talented in a lot of different ways and that God has given them these abilities, both trained and natural, and the combination all of, but God uses us when we come to the point of saying we can't do this on our own. We can only do it through his grace and through his power. Just like Gideon, we're confronted with the presence of God. We see ourselves as who we are in relation to him. When he realized that he was in the presence of an angel of God, he feared for his life, and God said, don't worry, you're not going to die. But he realized of the holiness of God being when he was in the presence of God like that. He realized his own strengths and their accomplishments seem like weakness when we're in front of God. Number 3, those who are called into leadership of the kingdom of God face constant temptation to exchange his divine agenda for our own personal agenda. We see this very often, right? When we serve God, it's always to be about him. Now, one of the things I appreciate about First Baptist Pineville, now I'm a church member. I sit right back there on the pew almost every Sunday morning that I'm not in a pulpit somewhere else or traveling. I appreciate the way you take care of our ministers. Now, we are all ministers. Let's get that right? But our vocational staff, one of the reasons we joined here was because of the staff, and the other one was because of the people, and God was leading us here. But not too many churches will give sabbaticals to staff. And if you're one of those that doesn't agree with giving sabbaticals to staff, let me say, I think you're wrong. I'm in the pulpit, so I can say that right. But having been on staff at one church on a staff for 20 years, I wish that was something that our church would have done. It helped, about every 7 years, I would say, in my ministry, there was a time in those 7 years, it's not like I wanted to go, but it was a time like I was kind of burnt out and I'm tired of the same problems and I'm tired of the same old things and all that. And I never got a sabbatical to leave, which would have been of great help. I love the way you treat our staff because you give them the grace and the freedom and the time to be away from the church. Does that make sense? Not that they're not a part of the church, not that they're not still doing for the church, but I said this at the early service, the other church this morning. Do you realize that Sunday comes every 7 days? Do you realize that? Your staff realize that more than anybody else. Every 7 days, Sunday's going to be here, whether the pastor is ready to preach or not, whether the music is ready, whether the children, the youth, the education, the facilities. Every 7 days, we gather together, don't we? And it's good for a staff and a pastor to be given the grace to be away every once in a while, even on vacation from time to time, and especially on a sabbatical when they can get away and refresh and be ready to hit the ground running again. So that's a side note. I always want to say something positive every time I'm in the pulpit about a staff of a church. But coming from a member of this church for 2.5 years now, that's one of the things I truly appreciate about us is the way we treat our staff and the way that we give them grace and I don't even know what the right word would be to be able to be away. Now that's aside. Sorry, we'll get back to that. That just popped into my head there. But number 4, God's call in the lives of His people is based upon His grace, not upon our own merit. I think we all realize that. And then when we realize that God has placed a call in your life, no enemy can stand in your way. The victory is sure. In between Christmas and New Year's, now I have two times of the year for New Year's resolutions. I've been in education all my life. I've worked with schools all my life. I work in a school now. So the 2 times of newness in schools are August and January, right? August, I always determined when I was in elementary school, this year I'm going to make straight A's. And I did it for about 3 weeks. And I loved the newness of my notebooks until they were not new in about 3 weeks and all those kind of things. And then as we come to the new year, we think about and look back upon what has God done in the life of First Baptist Church of Pineville and LeCount over 2024. What has God brought you through? What are the hardships that you've had to walk through? What are the different things God has done in the life of our church that only God can do? And as we look forward to 2025, to me, it's always about not what can I do for God, but God, what do you want to do through me in this new year? God, don't tell me what's all coming in 2025 because I'll probably run right now, right? You ever been there? Don't tell me what was coming in 2024. I'm glad you didn't, that I found out along the way because you gave me enough grace to sustain it at every point. But as we start this new year, my prayer is that our attitude towards God and towards His calling in our life is, God, I am here. I will do what you call me to do. It may mean making sacrifices in my own family. It may mean I have to give up some things in my own family that aren't godly, that I'm leading and doing, I'm not leading and doing my family right, and I need to change. That may be me, that may be you, that may be all of us. Just like Gideon's dad had to make changes as he was confronted with what God wanted him to do, what God did through his son in their family's life in the nation of Israel. It may mean some challenges for you and for me as moms and dads and grandmas and grandpas and whatever it is that we happen to be. We may need to make some changes in our lives because God is calling us to make changes. And I'm just talking about on a personal level. I'm not addressing anything that I know of or anything else in the life of the church or in your life this morning. but God may be calling us to make some changes. And the other thing I would say is say yes to God when He calls you to do something as we go into this new year, whether it be in our church, whether it be to minister in your workplace, to minister in your home, to minister in our community, wherever it may be. Say, God, if you're calling me to do this, I will trust you enough to do it. That's my challenge for you this morning as we finish out 2024 and as we're moving into 2025. On this Sunday in between Christmas and the New Year, as we all hopefully have a little bit more time off of work and a little bit more time with family for New Year's this week, I pray that God would speak to us and say, God, we want to see you do some mighty things in my life and my family's life and the life of our church as we move into this new year.